live our lives in cycles. The cycle of the school year, the cycles of the seasons, the cycle of the washing machine. Horror also has its cycles. Vampires, werewolves, zombies, witches. They come and they go, iterating and renewing the narratives of the past. There is horror in the mundanity of the cycles. Just ask Jack Torrance at the Overlook Hotel. There is horror in the grandiosity of cycles. Just look at the resurgence of Nazis in the United States and the desire for authoritarian overreach by the executive branch of the government. And there is horror when cycles repeat too quickly, when school shootings happen over and over without respite, when we cannot take a breath from the overwhelming news cycles of the day. In today's episode of Horror Joy, we take up the strange cycles of the Amityville Horror. In the movie, we follow George and Kathy Lutz as they move into a seemingly idyllic house with their 3 kids, already a kind of cycle of white flight. But what seems like domestic bliss soon turns to terror as they are confronted by ghosts of the past and the compulsion of the devil himself. Beyond the basic concerns about the satanic panic, there is something important about the fact that George looks eerily similar to the man who murdered his family just 1 year ago in the very house they now occupy. George seems to stand in for the cycles of domestic violence that have been perpetuated by angry men on their spouses, children, and communities.
We are also confronted by the inability of institutions to protect the innocent. In this case, the Roman Catholic Church is ineffectual at intervening in the horror that ensues in the home. Father Delaney is driven away by flies, illness, and ultimately a kind of insanity-induced blindness. We could read this as the infiltration of evil into our safe and organized communities. But we can equally read this as the hidden nature of violence that is already there, a worry that continues to grow in our current political landscape. So, sharpen your favorite axe as we dig deep into the basement of our cyclical existence. And whatever you do not leave your dog in that haunted house. This is Horror Joy. We're your hosts. I'm Jeff Storinoff.
And I'm Brian Onishi. We're 2 professors celebrating the emotional and intellectual joys of horror. All right, y'all, welcome back to another episode of Horror Joy. Today we are tackling the Amityville Horror from 1979. This is one that I actually have never seen before. Watch it for the very first time for this episode. And I'm excited to talk to you, Jeff, about it and to hear your thoughts about it. We can set this up. It feels like a pretty classic story now. There is a family that moves in to a house with a lot of history. I think the opening scene is really interesting. I want to get your thoughts about that. I like the way that they kind of integrated this horrific opening scene with the shots of the couple being shown the property for the first time. So I want to talk about that, what it means to buy property, what that's like. What's going on with George, I think, is interesting to me. Why does he look like that guy that had already been there and perpetuated the violence? All this stuff, right? But then, of course, you dig deeper, as it were, down into the basement, and you get to the bottom levels, and there's some stuff down there. The dog knows. The dog always knows. It takes a while for the humans to get there. It takes a while for even the Roman Catholic Church to get there. I think the Roman Catholic Church plays an interesting role here as well. If you haven't seen this movie, there are lots of iterations of it. There was, in the 2000s, another remake made, and I think they've made some after that, continuing the story. So we can talk about houses. We can talk about the satanic panic. We can talk about marital bliss. We can talk about the perpetual violence of white men on their communities and their families and what that's like. But Jeff, I want to hear your first thoughts on the Amityville Horror. You've seen this before. You've seen it a few times, you said. So what do you think? What's going on? What's your take?
Yeah, I think all the things you're mentioning here are worth conversation, worth talking about. We'll have to come back to, I think, especially the Satanic Panic, which it's been about a year now, but we spent a few episodes discussing the Satanic Panic, looking at Halloween for our Halloween special last year, for what the Satanic Panic meant in the United States, how it was reflected in film and culture. This is another one of those movies, honestly, folks watching this movie, it's based on the 1977 novel, of course, which is supposedly semi-true, but there's a lot of controversy around that has since arisen where it was kind of made up, maybe exaggerated at times. But at its core, we have a classic haunted house story here. We have this really, to my mind, bizarre looking house. The windows almost look like eyeballs when it's lit up at night. The opening scene, I think, for us as viewers, taints the house because we know what happened there. And then we come to the scene like moments later where George and Kathy Lutz are touring the house with like the oh so very 1970s realtor, like just 1970s chic there. Way to go. And like at first you don't know that they know what happened there. And that anxiety, I think, is meant to remind us of what happened there. And as you're saying, like there are shots of them entering rooms where then we get to see what exactly happened in the room too, when the family was shot by, I think the son, it was like the younger, one of the children ends up shooting his younger siblings and then also his parents. So it's a little discomforting to start, but it seems otherwise like a very Edenic, beautiful setting. I think you used the word idyllic in the cold open, and that's exactly how I describe it. This is prime real estate. Even in 1979, it cost $80,000, which I didn't do the math to figure out what it would be in 2025 dollars, but I'm sure it's way exceeded inflation, and it probably is like a few $1,000,000 to buy a house like that on the river on Long Island, I'm pretty sure. So, they're getting a deal is kind of how this works out. It seems the family, the couple, Kathy and George, are recently married. The children are Kathy's from a previous relationship, previous marriage. That's never made quite clear to us. We know that Kathy has some connection with the Catholic Church. So, we get Rod Steiger showing up as Father Delaney, which is great. And then the other priest who has like the equally awful 1970s haircut, who is like just fresh back from Vietnam or something. But like, yeah, it's a haunted house, and it's scary because all these things change. The house itself is kind of disheveled, which a lot of these haunted house stories that we see as cinema or TV are. It reminds me, or I was, having a lot of flashbacks to American Horror Story. I was having flashbacks to The Shining, just some of these other places where the house itself is haunted and seems to take on a life of its own. So yeah, like classic haunted house story with a family that comes in thinking like, oh, what could possibly happen to us? And it's like, well, a lot of really terrible crap actually. And they ignore all the signs. Of course, George is like way too stubborn to suggest, okay, maybe we should just move. Because Kathy brings it up a few times, like we should just leave right now. And George is like, no. And then he just keeps getting creepier and more sallow, colder, sitting in front of a fireplace in desperate need of a haircut and a shave. I know, like, yes, James Brolin is apparently a sex symbol of the 70s or whatever, but man, get a haircut. Like, it's just that's some of the horror we have going on in this film too, Brian. If I may just say, we need some male grooming, okay? So I want to turn it back over to you with a haunted house. Maybe we can get a little bit of the satanic panic. But yeah, I'm interested for you as a first-time viewer, what really stuck out to you?
Yeah, so I thought maybe when he was sharpening his axe over and over and over again, that maybe he was going to cut his hair with that. Like that was going to be his new instrument for grooming. It didn't turn out that way. The thing, I mean, I'm always interested in these kind of opening shots. It sets the stage, it sets the tone for the rest of the movie. That happens here because you get this sequence of shots where we see violence in the home, right? Somebody with a gun. I'm not sure if it was the son because as we go through, we get this idea that George looks very much like the person who perpetuated the violence. And I think that's one of the things that really stuck with me. So maybe I'm wrong here, and we can talk about that. But later on in the movie, he goes to the bar, and the bartender's like, you're the spitting image of that guy that shot everybody in that house. And like, there's something to me about the cycles of violence that happen and are perpetuated through George. There's a couple of congruences here that we can talk about. One, the haunted house. It seems like there's a sense in which George is being like, I've just lost the word, where you're like inhabited
Possessed?
by a demon. What is it? Yeah, that's it, right? Like this is, but that's the question. So we have the sense in which a classic haunted house story tells the tale of ghosts and the past haunting the space. And I want to talk about the house a little bit, but here it's revealed to us, and spoiler alert, folks, if you haven't seen this, I'm sorry, it's revealed to us later on that there's like a gateway to hell in the basement. And so more than ghosts, we're dealing with a demonic situation. And that's highlighted by the Roman Catholic Church, the fact that Father Delaney, he cannot step inside the house. The nun also gets violently ill when she shows up at the house, that the blessing that's supposed to take place just can't happen. Father Delaney at some point can't even call, can't even communicate with the house because of the presence of the devil, right? And I think there's something there about the demonic aspect of it that maybe challenges the typical haunted house aspect of it. On the other hand, George seems to be possessed. He's possessed by the demons, the spirit of the person who perpetuated the violence beforehand. It's unclear, but there are these times when you just see in his eyes like something's wrong, and he's sharpening his axe, or he's like tearing apart the parlor for the caterer's money or whatever. But there's just something about that sense of violence that I wonder, right? And Jeff, maybe this is a question for you. When, I don't know, we've been talking off mic about how different small town communities are treated in horror in the United States than they are in the UK. I think we have this kind of hillbilly horror in the United States that looks different in the UK. It's like folk horror a little bit more. And we talked about Appalachian folk horror. There's definitely folk horror here in the United States, but the hillbilly folk horror, I wonder, right, is there a possession of George by this sense of, I don't know, maybe disrupting cycles? Is this Jack Torrance in some way? He stops working. He's, there are definitely times during the movie that it made me think of The Shining and Jack Torrance and going crazy, and again, kind of seeking out the family as the landing of one's violence and one's anger and one's frustration and all of those things, right? It just seems as though there's some perpetuation of that violence in George. So I'm going to throw it back to you here with the question about the house itself. In some way, the house is a symbol in horror, flipping what used to be safe into something that's horrific. I read an article called Echoes of Evil, Haunted Houses, and Lingering Terrors in the Amityville Horror and the Conjuring by Julia Seltneroch. And one thing that they point out is that in this kind of movie, this is a quote, "The house is no longer merely a setting. It is an entity, a dynamic force that disrupts the boundary between past and present, reality and nightmare." They go on to say the traumatic past, whether an act of violence, betrayal, or supernatural disturbance, is imprinted upon the structure, transforming it into a repository of unresolved horror. So how does the house, like you mentioned how scary it looks. For you, how does the house show up, both as a scary thing, as the uncanny, right, the thing that was safe and is now unsafe? But how does that play with this idea that we're dealing with demonic entities, that the Roman Catholic Church cannot seem to get a grasp of it? How do these two things for you play? And if that's not something you want to answer, you want to go somewhere else, go for it. But that's the question I think I have is how does the horror of the house itself and the demonic aspect of the movie, how do those things coincide? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if it's something like we have horror of home ownership here. But I don't mean that like in the sense of, obviously for many millennials, Gen Zers in this country currently, home ownership's not something they're ever going to achieve, depending where they live, because the cost of a home now outstrips the average income by like double, triple, depending where you live, especially. But I mean it more in the sense of, in the cold open, you allude to white flight and how this is also part of the Satanic panic, where you have a lot of middle class, upper middle class families moving out of urban centers into suburban areas. And this drastically changes community and how community functions, which is another conversation you and I have been entertaining off mic. But I think maybe a key difference we see in the United States as opposed to the UK is in small towns, there's just generally a lack of community, particularly during this time period when you are building suburbs that did before that point in time exist. There's not really a community there. And instead, you're just putting all of these homes where everyone has like their property and no one really crosses property lines to say hello to each other. They just sort of exist. So some of the horror I think here is isolated to the house. The demonic possession is isolated to the house because the family itself is isolated. there isn't a community they can fall back on because the church, they have to come in from the city into out to the suburbs to try to help, and they aren't able to do so because they can't get into the house. It almost seems like there could be some conversation or some critique of suburban life and of white flight and how it completely neglects community and the need for support networks. George's character, like his friend Jeff and one of his other, like his partner, his business partner, are like, hey, I think Jeff is his business partner, is saying, hey, like you're really slacking. We have bills that need to be paid. You haven't signed the checks, stuff like that. He's completely fallen out of the obligations and the responsibilities that he has because he's trying to live up to this rugged individualism of America. Heck yeah, I'm gonna get there on my own, pull myself up by my own bootstraps, and demonic possession be damned. I can do it on my own. But then, of course, you get the kind of scary history of the house where the former landowner there was a witch and conducted all sorts of sacrifices and stuff, and then that's how this gateway to hell came to be in the basement with the sort of woo-woo friend, Jeff's wife Carolyn. She has psychic proclivities. I mean, the demonic possession, I think, is part definitely referencing the Satanic Panic. It is meant to make us afraid, Satan, afraid. It's all part of like the religious rites turn. I mean, Dobson, focus on the Family Guy. Dobson just died recently. We could maybe go down to hell and try to find him there. We have all these other evangelicals who are making themselves TV famous, TV preachers during this time period. It ends up in the giant anal wart that is Ronald Reagan, and for 8 years in the United States of America, with Nancy, polishing things as Ronnie chows down on gummy bears. The whole culture of the country is being pushed this way. So the Satanic Panic is, of course, meant to make us afraid. But I think too, like, it's a critique of masculinity. It is a crisis of masculinity during this time period. It is some very toxic American masculinity that we're looking at through someone like George, who can't actually recognize that he needs help. It's part of the mental health crisis that has been plaguing this country for the past 40 to 50 years. I think in some ways, rewatching the Amityville Horror in light of everything that is going on currently in 2025 and has been going on since arguably 2010, 2000, maybe even the year 2000 2001 with 9/11. I think this is a microcosm of the macrocosm that is the failed state of the United States. Like, we're going to do it our way. We are not going to ask for help or ask for anyone's guidance on this. And if I end up being possessed by a demon because I did not seek help and like read the tea leaves or read the signs on the wall, then so be it. And we'll just throw the baby out with the bathwater because it's my way or the highway. And that's like, at the end of watching this movie again for the, I think, fourth time now, I'm just really struck by how kind of awful George is at recognizing his family's in crisis and instead focusing on himself and what he wants. And being a homeowner and being like, the self-made man is everything George wants. And he doesn't recognize the peril of demonic possession and what it's doing to his family. And he barely goes back for the dog, which, is reprehensible. So, Brian, I think I might have answered one of your questions there, but I do want to go back to you. So what about this idea where the home could be a microcosm for the macrocosm of the state?
Yeah, I like what you're saying there. I think that's a really compelling point. In many ways, what we're doing is we're setting up barriers to community. And I love this scene where Jeff meets George at the bar, and George is like, he's possessed or whatever. He's got this weird look on his face, and then he punches Jeff, and he goes to pick Jeff up, and Jeff goes, okay, finally, now can we talk? It's like, oh, you got the punching out. Now let's go. Right? I think that perpetuates this idea that what men need to do is to get out this physical violence in order to move on, and that's a weird thing. But it pushes away community. It pushes away intimacy. And I think that there's a sense to me in which, probably heretical, you can read this movie as like critique of rural MAGA Christianity. Of course, that's not the intent. That was not, I don't know, like you're talking about all the ways previous political ideologies, Reagan, et cetera, have infiltrated. But here, the rural communities are actually the ones that are just filled up with satanic possession. And I think there's something there that you could critique, right? All of the MAGA Christianity, y'all, I don't know your theological commitments, whatever they may be. It feels like the exact opposite of what a Christian would think, and therefore is literally anti-Christ. We can move on. The thing that I find interesting here is that George, as the kind of symbol of masculinity, I like that you brought that up, because one of the things that I wrote down was this idea that toxic masculinity is a kind of possession narrative, that you are possessed by this idea that home ownership is important. I also wrote down mortgage horror, like all of the responsibilities that he takes on himself. He married a family. These are his stepchildren. And I had stepparents. I have a stepmother. Love her dearly. Had a stepfather at one point. There is something very delicate about that relationship. And George does not deal with anything delicately. There's no sense of the difficulties of what he's doing, the difficulties of moving his family out to a place where they don't know anybody, the difficulties of being this kind of newly formed family, the difficulties of taking on fatherhood late in the game, I think are not touched on. And there's something about masculinity there that I think is really important. Like you're saying, that this highlights this kind of horror of toxic masculinity. So I also wrote down uncanny dad horror. I think we get uncanny mom horror often, right? The mother as caring figure, when that turns, especially in something like the Babadook, right? We saw that. It's different when uncanny dad horror, like in The Shining or here, is an amplification of this idea that we need to protect. So he's sharpening his axe. He's getting ready to protect. He's getting his weapons ready, as it were. And the amplification of what we think of as masculine is what ends up tipping over into horror. So it's not the flipping, like I think what happens in the uncanny mom horror. It's the amplification in uncanny dad horror. And so I was thinking of the song way back in the day, listening to Pedro the Lion. If anybody's a fan of Pedro the Lion, David Bazan, I used to love Pedro the Lion. And he's got a song called Simple Plan. And it's about like a kind of communist socialist utopia. But the man of the family realizes that he no longer is relied upon to care for the family. And so he sits alone in his room with a shotgun because he can't take it. He can't take the idea that he's not the one making the money for his family. And there's something about that, right? The idea that to the detriment of one's family, you will work to protect them, right? To the ill of the family, you will work to do what you think you are supposed to do, to fill the role that you think is there. And I wonder, so how this shows up in terms of religion, it's a little bit unclear to me. I don't know. I'm going to go back to that article that I mentioned, because at one point they say the theological dimensions of demonic hauntings often intersects with the horror tradition's depiction of possession as a form of bodily and spatial invasion. And so again, here we have the invasion of the house, not the haunting of some ghost, not the thing that's lived there in the past, but the possession of the house. Right. And I don't know what that distinction does. So maybe we just move on from there. But I just want to ask you, like, you're once Catholic, now no longer, as far as I can tell. You fill in if you want. But what are we getting in the Catholic Church here? We have a priest, Father Delaney, and he seems to be wanting to do some kind of exorcism. But the priests say no thank you, right? The rest of the priests say no thank you. And I think at one point, the thing that really struck me, and I wrote it down, or at least I tried to write it down, was that one of the priests says no. Father Delaney goes, is that the fashion now, to cover up? And it's just hard not to think of the sexual abuse cover-up that happened in the Roman Catholic Church. But just curious, right, if you had any insights about the Catholic Church, what's going on, how it's being used, satanic panic, but just generally as a foil, but also, right, as the father figure. This is Father Delaney, and of course matched up with Father George, not in the the theological sense, but it just sees the stepfather, George. Is there anything there with the Roman Catholic Church? What's going on here with the Amityville Horror? We can then jump into like this. We've talked about it a little bit already, but the small town maybe aspect of what's going on in Amityville. So if you have any thoughts about that, you can take us wherever you want. Talk about Beelzebub and the flies. I don't know. There's lots there. What do you think?
I mean, I think like the references to Catholicism are kind of like window dressing. It's like, hey, there's demon. What do we do? And there's a demon. Priest. We need a priest. And as it turns out, Kathy is very Catholic. Has a crucifix. Even when they're moving into the house, there's an entire scene where George is like, what do I do with this thing? I don't know why George has a southern accent suddenly, but he's like, I don't know what to do with this. And Kathy's like, oh yeah, we should hang it right there in the room, whatever. And then of course later on it turns upside down, and like in every movie where there's an exorcism or demonic possession, the crucifixes just go insane. Interestingly, Father Delaney, we find out in that meeting of the minds with the burnout hippie priest and then the two older guys, one of whom is the mayor from Jaws, by the way, played by the same actor. And I was like, oh no, not you again. And you're playing a villain here too. Imagine that. He's also has a secular degree of some sort, like he's a psychologist. And they're seeming to like point out to him that you can't come in here with your secular knowledge and tell us what we know and don't know. And is it a critique of the Catholic Church covering up sexual abuse scandals? I mean, maybe. I don't know if that's really in the public mind in the 70s, right? But I think it's more of like post-Vatican II, the Catholic Church is really trying to be like, hey, we are not the church of smells and bells. We are not like incense and bells ringing and this high mass in Latin and stuff like that, which ironically, we've seen the more conservative Christian nationalist arms of the Catholic Church moving back towards that pre-Vatican II style. So the Deus Vult, which we think, or we're pretty sure Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is a part of. We know that Peter Thiel, one of Donnie's big funders and essentially J.D. Vance's puppeteer or puppet master, whichever it might be, is also like involved in those right-wing Catholic circles. But again, tune into Straight White American Jesus for more on those stories. In this case, though, this is where the church is trying to say we're modern. We don't believe in things like exorcism anymore. And like this is a trope that happens in some horror movies in the 70s and 80s, or even like in God. There was that reality TV series that involved Lorraine Warren and some students at Penn State called Paranormal State from back in like the early 2000s. So, Brian, I see you're shaking your head. At some point, we got to do a deep dive on this series because it's wild. But the Catholic Church, they don't recognize exorcisms anymore. That's a thing where, like, it's not like it is in the movie The Exorcist. It's not like it was in the old country. We don't believe in exorcisms anymore. That's not a real thing. And so there's always a priest who has to go and, like, do it secretly because the parish, the diocese will not officially recognize the need for exorcisms. And, I mean, like, why is that? So, I mean, I think it's a tough question. Like in some ways, I think it's just about modernization. The church doesn't want to be thought to be stuck with some what many folks would call medieval thoughts and ideas about demons. And other ways, I think maybe it's self-preservation because you could have all sorts of lawsuits involved with something after The Exorcist. Not that I've done any research on this, but I imagine that there was probably a lot of fallout after a movie like The Exorcist because of the amount of physical body horror that is experienced during an exorcism. And anytime you watch an exorcist movie or a movie that includes an exorcism, let me put it that way, it seems that there's just all sorts of property damage and physical body damage that, as an institution, and maybe that's what's happening here. The church is realizing itself as an institution and it doesn't want to get involved in any sort of legal trouble. But if this comes back to your question then about community and small towns, and what does it mean to live in a small town? And the difference with the small town that we're seeing here, and I'll turn it over to you then to see what, to get some of your thoughts on this small town-ness of the horror here. Suburbs and small towns aren't exactly the same thing. Like, I know that we conceive of them as the same thing in the United States, but like a rural village is not the same thing as a suburban town that popped up in the 60s, 70s, or 80s, or anything mid-century. Because like there's never an idea of a main street. It's more of a cul-de-sac. Like we talked about this a little bit with Gwendolyn Keist's The Haunting of Elkwood, where Velkwood is essentially created as a neighborhood, a cul-de-sac. And I think in suburbia, we have neighborhoods, whereas in rural areas, and even part of the United States, in parts of the United States, there are small rural towns. I live in one, Roaring Spring, Pennsylvania, that was conceived of as a small town and has a main street and has community centers in that way and has churches and such. But where the Lutzes are, they're in a suburb that doesn't have any centralized like heart, if you will. Instead, it's just sprawling suburbia. And if you want help, again, I keep coming back to this idea like where they had to seek out help in the city or in like, in town somewhere to have then the church come out and help them. Like they're far enough away where it's not like the priest, the pastor, whomever can just walk over. So I think this comes back to the themes you're talking about of like isolationism, of do-it-yourselfness, of frankly just stubbornness, of being unwilling to seek out help, but also maybe that it's not readily accessible or available. So Brian, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Some of the small town elements of this film and the horror therein.
Yeah, so to open it up and to kind of peek behind the scenes, Jeff, you and I have been talking about trying to imagine connected episodes. And so we were thinking, oh, let's do some small town horror stuff. I'm not really sure that fits here. However, I think what you're saying about the do-it-yourselfness is important. And one thing that I think happens is when you decide that you're going to do it yourself, that you are the one that is going to perpetuate the virtues of living and the good life. If something goes wrong, you have one of two options. Maybe there's more. Probably there's always more options. But to simplify, it's either my fault, right, because I'm doing it by myself, or it's somebody else's fault. It's the outsider's fault, the immigrant's fault now in the United States or whoever. But here it's like, look, you've got George. He's the same white dude. Like they keep telling him he just looks like the same guy over and over again. It's not him. The same white guy keeps perpetuating violence, whether it's Ronald Reagan or Donald Trump. Same white guy perpetuating violence, whether it's this school shooter or that school shooter. It's not their fault, though. It's not their fault, right? It's somebody else's fault. It's the same church. It's a Catholic church, Christian church. Not their fault. Don't worry about it. Not their fault. Blame somebody else. It's the Satanist's fault. It's Satan's fault, in fact. Let's blame Satan. Yeah, that's whose fault it is. Or mental institutions. It's somebody else's fault, and we've got to find a scapegoat. It's not the standard of normalcy. It's not George. Man, George is just trying real hard. He's trying to cut some wood. He's just trying to make a good life for his family. He's got a boat. I think when they look at the house for the first time, they're like, oh, we would save so much money if I didn't have to pay docking fees for my boat that I have. It's like, I don't know. You have a boat, George? I don't know what's going on there. All that to say is I think lining up with some of the ideas that I've been having lately and a desire to build community here in maybe fitting your distinction between rural towns and small towns. I think living in a small town, the desire for community is strong. And how do you go about doing that? How do you go about building that? I think it requires giving up the idea that you can just do it all yourself. So I'm not sure exactly how that plays in here. I think you're right. The isolation aspect of it, they're not really isolated. It's not a cabin in the woods. They're not even on an island like Jaws or The Menu, but they feel isolated. And I think that's part of it, that the feeling of isolation is strong, such that not only can George not see himself cracking and failing and falling, but the people outside of him can't either, because there's nobody. Jeff comes in and's like, hey, we need to make some money, man. You're not useful to me anymore. Go ahead and punch me. That's fine. Let's get down to it. Let's get the receipts now. Let's figure it out. And I just think that this does show a lack of community, and the isolation here is about not having somebody that knows you and sees you and is able to say, hey, man, this is not you. Got to do something. I agree with you. The Catholic Church is just like a stand-in for somebody that might be able to fix it or to know, to cue the reader into what's going on. And Jeff's wife, right? It's just a throw in that she's like, yeah, I know about this stuff. And all of a sudden, she knows all the details about Satanists and witches and whatever. It's just a way to tell us it feels clumsy. So here's where I'll take us. I think right now is, I think that this movie is clumsy. That's not one that I'm going to put on often. I think the opening scene is really interesting, interspersing the shots of the house. Right, seeing the house for the first time. You walk into a house for the first time and you're like, oh, look at all the potential. And having the traumatic history and memory of that house transposed right onto it is really interesting to me. This is why I really appreciate the fact that we bought a fairly new house. I think the newer the house, the less likely there are ghosts in your house. You know me, Jeff. I don't believe in ghosts. Come at me if you want. Staunch disbelief in ghosts. That's me. But the newer house you buy, the less ghosts. I think that might be true. Anyway, all that to say is I'm just not sure that I was like deeply compelled by this. There's a lot of, it seemed like, there's The Shining and The Exorcist and all of these movies that seem like are really compelling films. And this one is weird. It's weird. I don't know what it is. What are we doing here? Is it a haunted house? Is it a devil worship house? I don't know. Jeff, I'm going to throw it back to you, and I'm going to ask you this question too, because you and I both read this article that deals with the satanic panic a little bit in terms of maybe technology, right? This is the Drew Beard article, Horror Movies at Home, Supernatural Horror Delivery Systems, and 1980s Satanic Panic. Something that gets argued there is this idea that, okay, like the movie didn't come out in the hot spot of the Satanic Panic. But just as like VHS stuff started coming out, this became really available and therefore really kind of hit the stride with the Satanic Panic. So I'm curious if you have insights about how the Amityville Horror, the VHS technology, and the Satanic Panic kind of work together. If you have thoughts about that, reading the Drew Beard article, again, take us where you want to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think responding to your last question first here, with the Drew Beard article and the idea of the Satanic Panic and VHS rentals and being able to see films in your home, I think this is maybe part of what we're missing with this movie. Like you and I, as people who are watching this film over 40 years later, it probably hit harder when people are watching it in their homes in the 80s, right after the supposedly true events it's based on happened, when folks are actively concerned about things like television and the end of society and the Satanic Panic. I mean, for us in 2025, we're more concerned with social media and how that is, it's maybe not a satanic panic, but the right, as particularly the political right in this country, is outraged about the ways in which social media is woke and turning all of the frogs gay or something, or like whatever the hell it is these idiots say. That's kind of their own version of the Satanic Panic. There's just thankfully a higher percentage, hopefully, of sane people who aren't buying into it. But I mean, I think Beard's article here is compelling. Like it's giving us something. It's making this film less clumsy than it currently is, because it's saying to us like, hey, like this was a fear. People were afraid of things penetrating the home, and things like a VHS and having videotapes, like where it used to be where you had to go to the movies to see these things, are now available at home. Whereas now we are desperately trying to beg people to go from their homes to go see things in movie theaters, and rescuing Nicole Kidman while they're there. But like this is just the sanctity of the home. It's such an American thing. Like the idea that the home is a family unit. It's not the extended family. It's the mom, dad, the two kids, the white picket fence, and the dog. This is a very distinctly American thing that was under threat from the Red Scare of communism for all of the Cold War. And then the Satanic Panic, when the Cold War was starting to sputter out, they were like, oh shit, we need another way to keep people afraid so that they stay in their silos, so that they stay in their small towns. They don't go to the big city because that's where the crime is, which is why our current president is sending military, sending the militia, sending the army, the Marines, whatever, to Los Angeles, or then Washington, D.C., and now apparently Chicago is up next. I guess what I'm getting at, like to answer your question, is like, again, it's a clumsy film. It's not very good. But all of the things that create this movie and made people want to see this movie and want to watch this movie and rent it or whatever are the same underlying streams of thought, same underlying belief systems that are still animating this fear of the outsider, this fear of anything outside of the home. When in reality, this that's a kind of a misreading of this movie, because like this movie is essentially the home expelling the people. So you brought up the Beard article. I just want to really quickly, there was a chapter from the edited collection Embodiment in Horror Cinema that I read earlier. The chapter is called The Red Scare, Marxism, Menstruation, and Stuart Rosenberg's The Amityville Horror. Our author here, Larry Dudenhofer, they make the point that this film, unlike some of its predecessors during this time period that involve exorcisms or hauntings or possessions, is really unproductive. And instead of having the body or the house brought back to some sense of normalcy, the house is just abandoned. Just going to read the quote here real quick. So the film thus ends anticlimactically. Rather than the church or the family expelling the spirits, as in The Exorcist and its imitators, the house expels its owners and their institutional supports. Moreover, the disappointment that the film's final sequence might occasion for viewers follows from the reproductive imperative of these supports in their relation to the family structure. In effect, the house menstruates the family right out of its front door, and thus their investment, as well as the mortgage company's interest in it, defaults for the month. And while I do find this a compelling argument, I think it's giving an awful lot of credit to a film that was probably just made to try to make some money. I don't know that the writer Rosenberg is thinking on that level. Again, we can't know. Sorry, that's the intentional fallacy coming for anyone who ever did a lit theory class. But like, and maybe in some ways this film is just meant to have two very attractive people in James Brolin and Margot Kidder on screen together doing a horror film. Not really making babies, but having babies provided for them. Not my cup of tea, either of them, but I'm sure in the 70s it seems to fit what people were looking for. And, you know, as a man's man, quote unquote, he doesn't really solve the problem that's brought up. And this is, again, time and again, that toxic masculinity fight against itself. And the Satanic Panic is very much that. And, you know, the question of how do VHS tapes and home rentals and all of that work within this, it's that people are afraid of ideas and people are terrified of having to confront ideas that disagree with everything they know. And rather than admit that they're wrong and rather try to like then revise their worldview and revise their understanding of how things work, they're just going to hide from it and pretend that it's going to go away. And that this film, I will say, like definitely does not let them pretend that it's going to go away. And it literally yeets them out the front door. Brian, I'm sorry if I didn't answer your question there because I'm a dum-dum, but I thought maybe I was getting to it. So I don't know. What should we find some joy? Should we start finding some joy with this film?
Yeah, I want to find joy. I want to just, of course, mention Candace Cameron Bure, who I think makes the same argument as the VHS argument. She says that, you know, like horror movies and screens in your house are like portals for the devil. I don't know if we know Candace Cameron, of course, from Full House, but is also like a evangelical whatever out there. So I think that lines up with what you're saying. I also want to point out that, yeah, this is mortgage horror again. The mortgage, the literal kind of death pledge when you enter a mortgage, that's what you're doing. And so maybe it's just coming to fruition. And here we are absolutely understanding that home ownership is just going to kill you. That's all. So, Jeff, why did you take us into the joy conversation? Where did you find joy in Amityville Horror?
You know, Brian, I'm going to punt. I'm going to punt it back to you because I need to think a little bit to find some joy. You tell me, where did you find joy?
Yeah, it's funny to watch a movie. I think it's a famous movie, right? You hear the Amityville Horror and there's so many remakes and reiterations of it. I think it was a different movie than I expected it to be. I wasn't sure if it was demonic possession, haunted house, or just, you know, again, kind of a dad going crazy or whatever. Small town horror, I don't know. And I think it kind of, not shocked me, but it surprised me the way that it turned. So there's something about that. So one, being able to watch a movie that has been around, wanting to watch for a long time, having heard about, there's some joy in that, of course, right? You now enter into a community of people who have seen this movie and you can have a conversation with them, which is what we're doing here. And I love that. Number two, I'm going to find joy in practical effects. So while this movie and the hair in this movie, the glorious hair for both Margot Kidder and James Brolin, maybe doesn't hit us right now, but there's something about the practical effects I think that's really cool, especially late in the movie. James Brolin, I think he goes back for the dog. He falls through the stairs. And here, is this the failure of his home ownership? He can't fix the stairs. He falls through into a pit of goo. I don't know what's going on there. But you have to imagine that if James Brolin actually did that, that he's just covered in black, oily, whatever, goo. I don't know. What is that? Satan's swimming pool, Satan's hot tub? I don't know. What's happening there? Don't know. But there's something about like just the fact that those are practical effects. I'm also going to point to, I think Jody is the imaginary friend of one of the children. And there's this weird scene where he sees a pig in the window. Again, this is probably reference to Beelzebub or whatever. There's something really funny about that. It's not scary. I mean, the one jump scene you get is like the eyes outside the window, and it's something like campy about that. But the pig in the window, again, probably a reference to Beelzebub. But there's just some joy in that. Like, what? Hey, what's the scary part of this movie? Oh yeah, remember that pig? Remember that pig? I don't know. There's something joyful about that. So, Jeff, if you thought of anything, I'm going to send it back to you. Where can we find joy in the Amityville Horror?
I'm gonna come to Rod Steiger, who plays Father Delaney. I think Rod Steiger is one of those like deep cut actors who shows up in The Heat of the Night and a few other films like during this time period. Just a great character actor. Father Delaney, he might be the only person who's actually, Rod Steiger, that is, actually giving us good acting in this movie, because James Brolin and Margot Kidder sure aren't. And the kids definitely are not. And Jeff and Jeff's wife, who I forgot her name again already, Woo Woo, they aren't either. There's like something kind of joyful about the grunginess or the griminess of the 70s that you're seeing in this film, with like the cars that are, you know, late model and everything's just burning oil and sending lead into the air, which is why people maybe were growing crazy and killing everyone. But you know, I mean, that's just a thought, a little side note there. I mean, I agree. The special effects are pretty good. James Brolin falling into the Satan goo pit there. And the doggo. You know what? The doggo brings me joy. I'm glad they saved the dog. I like that dog. Trying to protect the home. Doing a hell of a lot better job than George was throughout the entire film. And talking about it, you know, because I think, again, like if we often feel like during these time periods of upheaval and despair that we are new to this, and in fact we are not. You know, if I want to carry forward my argument earlier that this is showing us the beginnings of the failed state that is the United States, I know I shouldn't find that joyful, but somehow I kind of find it a little bit at least comforting that this has been going on for over 40 years and isn't something new to us, and it's just something we've inherited and have to figure out what to do about. So, Brian, turn it over to you for some final thoughts, and we can, you know, send our listeners off on their merry ways.
Yeah, I'll throw out Murray Hamilton as well. He plays the mayor in Jaws, and also, I don't know, higher priest? I don't know what he is. He's just the guy that says no. Once again, won't listen to anybody else, does whatever he wants, to everybody's demise. Murray Hamilton, seeing him, he's always the guy that says no. But yeah, I don't know. I think we did some good work. We're talking about toxic masculinity. We're talking about the failed state of the United States. We're talking about community. We're talking about haunted houses versus possession. Toxic masculinity as possession. I mean, there's so much here that we talked about, and I think there's something that we need to continue to do. Highlight all these ways that we can see horror as transgressive rather than a portal to evil. This is a mirror to our society, something that can allow us to see what's going on now, before, historically, etc. Like all of this stuff. Horror is a mirror. These monsters are mirrors, and the work that we're doing is joyful. So, next time on our regular schedule, I think we are going to tackle The Conjuring. We're going to go into another haunted house, another basement. I think we need to talk about the basement and see what we find there. But in the meantime, catch up on all of the Meet Your Makers we've got out there. A lot of amazing authors. Please listen to Meet Your Maker, buy their books, support indie authors. And as always, find joy, even in horror. This has been an episode of Horror Joy, produced in conjunction with Axis Mundi Media. Thanks for joining us. We want to hear from you. You can find us at Horror Joy Pod on Instagram or at Horror Joy Pod on YouTube. You can also email us at horrorjoypod@gmail.com, all one word. And you can, of course, find us wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a like, subscribe, leave a review. Until next time, remember, seek joy, even in horror.